It was the summer of 1864, and the Confederacy was gasping for air. Sherman's armies were closing in on Atlanta, a city whose fall could cripple Southern supply lines and morale. Every available regiment, no matter how exhausted, was rushed to reinforce the defenses, and the quickest way to move them was the railroad. Two trains were pressed into service that July night, each carrying hundreds of Confederate soldiers. Some were veterans of bloody campaigns. Others were boys, barely out of school, riding toward their first taste of war. Many were asleep, their heads resting against rifles or knapsacks, their boots muddy from the march to the depot. The trains were more than just transport. They were lifeboats carrying men into history. But there was a flaw in the system. Unlike today's precision timetables, Civil War railroads were patched together from local lines, each with its own rules, its own clocks, its own chain of command. The telegraph, still relatively new, couldn't keep pace with the frantic shuffling of men and munitions. A single mistake could send two trains onto the same track, and that night it did. The first train, overloaded and running behind schedule, lumbered southward toward Atlanta. The second, equally packed, was sent northward on the same line, its engineer unaware of what lay ahead. There were no reliable signals to warn them, no lights flashing red in the dark, just faith in paper orders, the judgment of dispatchers, and a hope that the rails ahead were clear. Imagine being one of those soldiers, lulled by the rhythm of wheels against track. Some played cards by lantern light. Others scribbled letters in cramped handwriting, promising families they'd return after the war. They had no idea that with each mile, the gap between the two trains was shrinking. The engineers were powerless too. Their locomotives roared like beasts, fueled by firewood shoveled into glowing mouths of iron. Their eyes strained against the southern night, but all they saw was fog and darkness. This wasn't just bad luck. It was a perfect storm. Overcrowded cars, rushed schedules, primitive communication, and a desperate army willing to gamble men's lives for speed. And here's the chilling truth. It could have been prevented. Some officers later admitted the orders were confusing, even contradictory. Others whispered that the pressure to deliver troops fast-forced dispatchers to take shortcuts they normally wouldn't. That raises the question. Was this disaster inevitable chaos, or was it negligence? We'll revisit that later, but keep it in mind as the story unfolds. These are the corners of history we rarely see, where the war's hidden machinery fails and men pay the price. If stories like this strike you as both tragic and fascinating, stay with us. This is what our channel is about, peeling back the polished layers of history to show what really happened in the shadows. By midnight, the two trains were racing toward one another, each heavy with human cargo. Soldiers slept, laughed, smoked, dreamed of home, unaware that steel wheels were drawing them into the deadliest moment of their lives. The first sign wasn't seen, it was heard. A distant whistle cut through the night. At first it seemed ordinary, just another train somewhere on the line. But as it grew louder, sharper, the truth dawned on the engineers. Another train was coming. There was no time to stop. Each locomotive weighed tens of tons, hurtling forward on narrow rails. Brakes screeched, sparks flew, whistles shrieked, but momentum is a merciless enemy. And then in a thunderous instant, iron met iron. The two locomotives collided head-on, their boilers bursting like cannons. Fire erupted, scalding steam hissed into the darkness, and wood splintered into deadly shards. The sound was so violent that farmers miles away swore it shook their windows. Inside the cars, chaos reigned. Soldiers were thrown against walls, crushed beneath beams, pierced by flying iron. Lanterns shattered, setting straw and uniforms ablaze. Some men died instantly. Others crawled through wreckage, blood mixing with coal dust. One survivor later recalled, "The shrieks and groans rose above the hiss of the boilers. It was a battlefield without an enemy." Doctors arrived within minutes, summoned from nearby camps, but what they found was carnage beyond belief. Amputations began right there on the tracks, surgeons working by lantern light. For many, it was too late, and the numbers, no one knows the exact toll. Official reports downplayed it, perhaps to spare morale, perhaps to hide mistakes. Some newspapers whispered of over 100 dead, others claimed several hundred. What's certain is that in a single night, more lives were lost than in many full-scale battles. Picture the aftermath. Twisted locomotives still smoking, cars overturned like children's toys, uniforms scattered across embankments, a single boot lying in the mud. Supplies, rifles, blankets, letters from home, strewn among the wreckage. The survivors carried scars, both visible and hidden. Some would march into Atlanta days later, bandaged and limping, their comrades left behind on the rails. Others were haunted for life, remembering the screams in the dark. This is why we tell these stories. Because the Civil War wasn't only about generals moving armies on maps. It was also about moments like this, where ordinary men with no enemy in sight faced death from the very tools meant to deliver them to battle. If these forgotten tragedies strike you, there are many more waiting in the shadows of history, right here on this channel. And so, while the world remembers Gettysburg, Antietam, or Atlanta, the men lost in the Great Train Wreck of 1864 faded into obscurity. They died not in glory, but in confusion, and their story almost died with them. Yet here we are, over 160 years later, piecing it back together. The wreck was so violent that even in the stunned silence afterward, the cries of the living rose above the hiss of escaping steam. Soldiers pinned beneath timbers begged for help. Others, bleeding and burned, staggered into the night like shadows. The fire from the engines spread quickly, consuming broken cars and trapping men inside. Local farmers were among the first on the scene, woken by the terrible crash. They arrived with lanterns, axes, and water buckets, hacking through wood to pull men out. Within an hour, camp doctors and surgeons rushed from nearby encampments, carrying crude medical kits. The rails became an open-air hospital. Surgeons worked by flickering lanterns, their sleeves rolled, knives and saws flashing in the smoky glow. Limbs were piled beside the wreckage. For some, the pain ended quickly. For others, it lingered in gasps and groans that echoed long into the night. Word of the disaster spread fast, but not far. Confederate officials realized immediately how devastating this was, not only in lives lost, but in morale. Atlanta was already under threat. To admit that hundreds of soldiers had been killed in a preventable accident before they even faced the Union Army would be a blow the public could not bear. Reports were softened, numbers blurred. Some dispatches simply called it a calamity on the rails. The true scale was buried beneath military necessity, but letters home told another story. Survivors wrote to families with trembling hands, describing twisted iron, the smell of smoke, the cries of dying comrades. One letter claimed, "More men perished here tonight than in a week of skirmishes." Yet these voices, private and scattered, were easy to ignore. Newspapers carried only fragments, and official histories passed over the wreck as though it never happened. Still, memory has a way of surviving where records fail. In local towns, families spoke of sons who left on a train and never returned. Farmers remembered pulling men from wreckage until their arms ached. And for the soldiers who lived, the wreck became a ghost that followed them into battle, a reminder that death could strike even before a musket was fired. Looking back, the Great Train Wreck of 1864 is more than just a forgotten accident. It was a warning. The Civil War was the first modern war, a conflict fought in the age of industry and machines. Railroads were meant to bring efficiency and speed, but without safeguards, they became as lethal as any battlefield. The wreck showed how easily progress could become tragedy. And yet, history almost forgot. While Gettysburg, Antietam, and Atlanta are carved into stone and memory, the men lost in the wreck were left to obscurity. They died not with glory, but with confusion, victims of urgency, of negligence, of war itself. Today, their story forces us to ask, was this unavoidable chaos? Or was it military negligence? Were these men simply caught in the machinery of war? Or were they failed by those who rushed them to their deaths? That's for you to decide. Leave your one-line verdict, chaos or negligence, and see where history's jury falls. The Great Train Wreck of 1864 reminds us that not every tragedy of war involves gunfire. Sometimes the deadliest battles are fought in silence and darkness, on rails that never should have carried men so far, so fast into disaster. If you believe more people should know these hidden stories, share this one forward. And if you want to uncover the next Civil War mystery with us, you know where to be. This is the place where the past gives up its secrets, one forgotten story at a time.